Thank you, live viewers. This is entirely speculative. Obviously, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. And you'll all accuse me of being terribly arrogant and conceited and full of myself, or asking myself what I would do, how I would arrange the afterlife if I were God. But I see no harm in trying to make the afterlife as just as possible. So you have the Abrahamic religions that say if you don't believe in God, you don't go to heaven. And there are also the two Eastern religions that say if you are a good person, you get to have a better afterlife. And if you're really, really, really good, you won't have to return again. But if you're even better than that, you would be some kind of bodhisattva who would willingly return to show other people not as wise as you how to get to heaven or lead a better life. So there are these categories of religion. But what about people who are atheists? We already know they go to hell according to the Abrahamic belief system, because technically they're idolaters, and idolaters worship their own dumb opinions, and or they worship idols, and they cannot be dissuaded from doing so. So I've created a system whereby you're actually closest to heaven if you're already Muslim, because if you pass this final exam to show you know the difference between good and evil, in theory and in practice, you pass the exam and you get to heaven. But what about the other religions below that? Well, below Islam, you would have Buddhism, which is an atheist ideology, an atheist philosophy, which is better than Hinduism because it's not idolatry. And below that is Hinduism, which is obviously idolatry with no codified moral system, with no codified principles. At least the Buddha tried to codify the Hindu moral system and came up with Buddhism. And then under that would be Christianity. I know that's controversial, but Christianity is, it's not just idolatry, it's idolatry and blasphemy. So it's the worst of them all. And so we have to ask ourselves, what about Jews? What kind of afterlife do they get? And we already know, or at least I know, that some ultra-Orthodox Jews believe in reincarnation. And but we also know that the Sadducees, who were active in the time of Jesus, did not believe in the afterlife. And we also know they are extinct. So because of the inadequacy of the scripture of Judaism, it's been very much a trial and error thing for Jews. But under Judaism, but because of Judaism, we have these two Gentile offshoots of the Abrahamic religions, Christianity and Islam. I guess what I'm trying to say is that, there is a kind of running order of religions. So let's say you're the bottom of the heap and you're Christian, and even if you died committing no other sin, um, which is very unlikely because the whole idea of forbidding idolatry and blasphemy is that it would actually prevent the other sins. But let's say in theory, you, a Christian, die committing no other sins, you'd still die guilty of idolatry and blasphemy, and therefore you don't go to the better place. But with the idea of reincarnation, it's more nuanced. I mean, if reincarnation didn't happen, then people just go to heaven or hell, and that takes the fun out of figuring out what happens to people, whatever their religion, whatever their state of belief, when they die. Atheists would be classified as idolaters. Agnostics, I would say, they're not as bad as atheists, and they would be considered better than atheists because the agnostics are, in theory anyway, prepared to entertain the idea of an afterlife and the Abrahamic God. So, some time ago, I posted about the snakes and ladders game of reincarnation. I might as well read it out to you rather than try and remember what it was, which I may not do perfectly. So I wrote, if I were God, I would divide humanity into Jews and Gentiles. Gentiles would be divided between Muslims and idolaters, which would include Christians and Hindus as well as Buddhists. Buddhism is described as an atheist philosophy, and atheists are basically people who worship their own dumb opinions and often say they would rather die than admit they are wrong. Buddhism is basically codified Hinduism without the idolatry. Without the idolatry in theory. In practice, however, Buddhists are often seen praying to the statues of the Buddha. All Christians are deemed to be guilty of idolatry and blasphemy, with 2 death penalties awaiting them in the afterlife. After these, sorry, sometimes I lose my place. My apologies. All Christians are deemed to be guilty of idolatry and blasphemy, with 2 death penalties awaiting them in the afterlife. After these are discharged, bad Christians would be reincarnated as Hindus, and good Christians reincarnated as Buddhists. So I'm going according to the capital punishment in Judaism. So if you're a Jew, you would attract the death penalty. If you're either an idolater or blasphemer, I just discovered a mistake in the links. I'm sorry, this is so chaotic, but just regard this stream as a kind of rough draft of what I am trying to refine and distill and summarize. So, okay, I won't bore you with the details of what kind of a death penalty you would suffer. So imagine you've actually died, and then you go to the afterlife, and then you will be told what whether you've been a good boy or a good girl, and you will have to, as a Jew, um, to uh, discharge any punishments, any capital punishments you might have cooked up in your Jewish life. And so, for most Jews, I think they would probably have a view, and therefore their afterlife is not particularly pleasant. And also, there's nothing in the Torah about an afterlife. So, um, so as well as living this terrible life of being a Jew with all their restrictions, they get to the other side and then discover that they might be guilty of some death penalty, and there are 36 of them. So it's not much fun at all. And part of my point is um, about Muslims inviting Jews to become Muslim is that the afterlife of a Muslim is much more fun than that of the Jew, because the Torah actually doesn't mention anything about the afterlife. And so that's not enough. And if you go by the 36 capital offences codified by Maimonides, you'll know that, well, you'll know that's quite a lot of them, and they need. So, it's a rather daunting afterlife after, quite a restricted life. And so if they took the whole thing literally, you would have thought they'd be converting to Islam in droves, but they don't. And this suggests that they don't take the afterlife seriously. And this suggests that they might not take God seriously. So why would they subject themselves to these restrictions? Maybe that's a question that they can best answer themselves. Maybe they don't know what else to do. Maybe they're just proud of being Jews and they're prepared to live and die as Jews without necessarily believing in the afterlife. And just having the status of being God's chosen people and being envied by Gentiles is sufficiently satisfying for these Jews. I assume that's what they think. If you can pin them down and say you haven't got much of an afterlife, have you? Because there are no lyrical descriptions of what heaven or hell might be, and that's why the Sadducees, who were the priests of the temple, of the second temple in the time of Jesus, got away with saying that they didn't believe in the afterlife because the Torah doesn't mention it at all. But the point of not believing in the afterlife is that you find it very difficult to act correctly because you don't think good will be rewarded or evil punished in the next life. So you will be understandably more reluctant to sacrifice anything in order to do the correct thing, speak truth to power in particular. So, because most people don't do that, then the civilization of people who mostly don't do that will fall sooner than people who will do the right thing and speak truth to power. So I said, you're Christian, you go to hell. But what is this distinction between a good Christian and a bad Christian? Well, people say that they don't. I'm a bit tired. Let me start again. Even though all Christians go to hell, there'll be, some Christians who are better than other Christians, right? And I think God, if He exists, would have a more nuanced approach and be able to measure them in a, I guess, black and white way. So while so there would be a kind of different, there would be a Christian hell, and then there would be the really bad bit for the really bad Christians, and then there would be the um, slightly better bit for the, the good Christians, but who are never the less guilty of idolatry because they worship a Jew. But the whole idea of the first and second commandments is that you, if you really took the whole idea of idolatry seriously, then it means you take the idea of God seriously. And if you do take the idea of God seriously, then you will not be lightly um, breaking his commandments. Okay, so I hope this is not too much of a mess. So the next paragraph is about Hindus. Good Hindus would be reincarnated as Buddhists, and bad Hindus would be reincarnated as Christians. Good Buddhists would be reincarnated as Muslims, and bad Buddhists would be reincarnated as Hindus. Good Muslims get to heaven, bad Muslims are reincarnated as Buddhists. So can you see a kind of snakes and ladder system to this conception of the afterlife? Most Jews, especially if they live in the West, have at least one death penalty awaiting them in the afterlife, so there's no need to envy these Jews. Bad Jews are reincarnated as Hindus, and good Jews are reincarnated as Muslims after they have had their death penalties, their post-mortem death penalties discharged. And then they will finally have a fighting chance at getting to heaven. I don't know if this makes any sense to you or not. I will post a link for you. And so the purpose of this is to, just be more nuanced than, just going to heaven or hell. And this is, meant to be a more inclusive approach, like, what about the people who fall outside the Abrahamic religions? What if they never heard of the Abrahamic religions? Of course, it's not, possible, in this day and age, but there must have been a time in, ancient times when they genuinely have not heard of the Abrahamic religions. So they would be confined into the punishment system of their own religion. And when they, graduate, I suppose, when, the Buddhist is a good Buddhist, then he becomes a Muslim in his next life. And then the Muslim, having proper guidance, will find it easier to get to heaven. But it's possible that he may not do that, and then the bad Muslim will go back to becoming a Buddhist. Um, so this is how I think it would work out, because basically it's not fair to send everybody to hell if just for not believing the Abrahamic religion, many centuries ago, when people didn't have the benefit of um, telecommunications and global travel, and people genuinely didn't know about people on the other side of the world with a very different religion to them. So I think that makes sense. I think, it's fairer than just sending everybody to hell. And this is my idea of being compassionate to sinners. And I hope it made some sense to you. Thank you for your attention.